Well, as Reverend Cantor mentioned last week, we are focusing this year in church on the question of what the unique challenges and inspiration and hopes are of being a human religiously in this exact moment in time. How what it means to try and navigate the spiritual life, the human condition in 2019, how is that different than it might have been 50 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago? We're beginning a worship series this week on the question of if the world as it is right now and people as they are, how are we challenged in being connected to God, to ourselves, to the world, to others? And this week's sermon comes out of one of the most consistent themes that we hear from friends and family and parishioners, which is that right now it seems difficult to pay attention to what truly matters, to experience moments that feel holy and good, inspired God moments, because life as it is for so many of us feels like it's simply too much. There's too much on the calendar, and our lives are hectic, that we have more to do in one day and seemingly less time to do it. That it's almost impossible to find actual experiences of silence in the world. That many of us can encounter more data in a Sunday edition of the New York Times than a farmer 1,000 years ago would have encountered in their entire life. And we're expected to make sense of this and digest it and be good parents and spouses and co-workers and citizens and have holy moments of ecstatic bliss where we can fit it in, which is nowhere, because no one will be quiet. And there's somewhere to go right now. It's not surprising to me that in that kind of environment as human beings, ancient practices like Sabbath and sabbatical are making secular returns. I have a friend who is an accountant, and staff members in their office have sabbaticals built into their plans. Fortune 500 companies have meditation rooms. My son's school has a meditation room where they go to experience moments of calm. There's digital Sabbaths that people are taking for 24-hour periods, putting their phones or social media away. You can go to coffee shops that proudly brag that they have no Wi-Fi. And people are playing games at dinner in which everyone puts their phone away and the first person to grab it has to pay for everybody's meal. Why would we do such a thing unless we felt desperately hungry for calm moments of actual connection and meaning? You can go to a far extreme and try to experience those by protecting yourselves from the outside environment. And if you are fortunate and privileged enough, you can pay for silence. Luxury cars are advertised on commercials for how quiet they are on the road. You can buy yourself a retreat. If you're rich, your home likely has less outside noise coming into it, and if you're poor, the chances that you hear your neighbors are far more likely. The destructive elements of noise and hustle affect people with fewer means more than the privileged. Just think about the fact that if you go to an airport and the TV is blaring news and there's things happening all the time, if you've got the means, you can literally pay for a quiet place to sit. Even the mere existence of pause and rest is a commodity for the wealthy in a society where nothing ever stops. You can go to the far extreme and try to experience utter silence, but if you do, you'll find out that nothing's really silent. There's a thing called an anechoic chamber, which is a room designed by engineers to soak up every possible wave of sound and produce what are the most silent rooms and spaces on the planet. The composer John Cage, the experimental musical composer, went into one of these anechoic chambers in 1951 at Harvard. When he went into the room, first of all, the engineer told him most people can do about 5 or 10 minutes before they start to freak out. because none of us have ever encountered silence like that. He went into the room and stopped, and all of a sudden, after the shock of the silence faded a bit, he reported that he heard two sounds: a high-pitched buzz and a low thumping sound, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The engineer in charge told him the high sound was his nervous system, and the low sound his blood circulating through his body. Now, some physicians I've read said that that's probably not the case on the nervous system. Maybe he had tinnitus. But the fact is that when things got silent enough, something was still buzzing. He wrote in his journal, "There will always be sounds. Before I was born and after, and I need not fear the future of music." A year later, he composed his famous piece 433, which is a person in silence at a piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in which the noise of the room becomes the music itself. There's one of the hosts of a podcast called Radio Lab, Jad Abumrad, and he went into an anechoic chamber a few years ago, but instead of the 5 or 10 minutes that most humans can stand, his goal was to do it for an hour. He recorded a narrative of his experience, and he said that about 10 minutes in, he began to hallucinate the sound of bees. A loud, droning sound that was so real it felt like they were about to sting him, buzzing around his body and face. And then about 20 minutes later, he heard, like you would, Fleetwood Mac. Like it was on the radio, the exact song Everywhere by Fleetwood Mac. He said his first reaction was to say, "Why did someone turn music on in here? This place is supposed to be quiet." And he realized that, like so much of the noise of our lives, the call was coming from inside the house. That neuroscientists had told him later that often when our brain gets quiet enough, it will produce its own noise. Which is good news and bad news for us. What it means is that no matter where you are in your life, there is a voice moving in you that will refuse to be silenced and will be heard. The bad news is that even if you find the quietest place on earth, there is a voice inside you moving that refuses to not be heard. I think I have often learned the wrong lesson about where God is in the world and in my life, believing too often that I will meet holy goodness and inspiration in the quiet, calm, still moments that don't exist. The Elijah story in the Bible that many of you know, where he meets God in a still, small voice, if you know that phrase. It's used in discernment work, where people are trying to discover their purpose and their calling, where life feels hectic and they don't know what to do, and so they pause and listen like Quakers. In this text out of 1 Kings in the Hebrew Bible, Elijah, this professional prophet, is having problems with a governmental agency that doesn't understand climate change. The king Ahab is in the middle of a drought and thinks that it's caused by Elijah or prophets or a lack of the right kind of prayer. Elijah enters into a prayer competition with the prophets of the empire versus him, 1 to 400. They pray as much as they can. They set stuff on fire. Elijah wins. Short story, he has all of them murdered. The king and queen get mad and chase him out of town. So Elijah is scared and stressed out. He runs, and like a lot of the Hebrew narratives of prophets, they're just like us. Tired, stressed out egomaniacs who refuse to listen to God until we're hit up over the head with a frying pan and told to listen. He says, "I'm going to get some sleep." And an angel of the Lord says, "No, you're not. Wake up, eat. We have work to do." And he says, "Nah, I think I'm going to get some sleep." And the angel of the Lord says, "No, you're not. Here's some food. We have work to do. Go up to the mountain and listen. you're going to find God there. So Elijah goes up and stands in the edge of a cave on a mountain, and a lot of you know this passage. A great mighty wind comes and blows across the cave, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And finally, he goes to the edge of the cave and puts his cloak over his ears and strains to hear what the text describes as a whisper, a still, small voice, which does not provide comfort. It says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Even in the most silent place on earth, a voice that's not always comforting. For me, I think it would be easy to see this as an escape narrative. I don't have to worry about God and the wind and the flood and the earthquake. When I calm down enough, I'll experience the still, small voice. In 2019, I would say, and there was a mighty tweet, but God was not in the tweet. There was a toddler who had climbed onto the counter again and had found a knife, but God was not in the toddler. There was traffic on 635, and the Lord was not in the traffic. But this is not an escape narrative. This is a story of a man who is being chased down by a God who refuses to not be heard. It's pursuit and not escape. It says to Elijah that perhaps God was in the wind and the fire and the earthquake and the flood and the rain and the torment and the depression and the tiredness, but he could only hear it in the still small voice. It showed up in the least expected place. And for me right now, the least expected place to find goodness and wholeness in God is in the noise itself, and not where I've been looking, in the silence. If we practice only looking for God in the quiet, joyful, still, healthy, pure moments of our lives, we won't experience much of God. Because if you're like me, those moments are few and far between. Much of my life looks like the traffic and the toddler and the tweets and the calendar and the noise and the illness and the noise and the noise and the noise. There's a lot of bad theology that would tell us that God is only present in parts of that wholeness and goodness are only present in parts of that. And if you practice only experiencing God in the health or in the silence or in the calm, the storm moments of your life will be very lonely ones. And the storm moments are real. On the other hand, there's bad theology, conservative and New Age alike, that tells you that this was supposed to be this way and God's in it and God deemed it so and the universe wanted you to have cancer because that's how things are supposed to be. If God's only in the good things, then the hard times are lonely. And if goodness and God are also in the cancer and the diagnosis, in the relationship problems and the layoff and the noise and the traffic, then it can also feel like, what did I do to deserve this? A better question, perhaps, in the noise of our lives is not how do I escape, but where is God moving in this too? Is there a possibility for wholeness and goodness that I can participate in this moment? Not that you're supposed to be sick. Not that the universe wants you to have problems. But that in the midst of them too, you can participate in goodness and wholeness worthy of the name God. See, where we find that in our lives, where we see God or goodness or the Spirit, whatever you call it, where we see it often depends greatly on the seer. In Annie Dillard's book, she spends years alone in the wilderness and comes out with a theology that says, God is not as gentle as you thought. She watches beautiful woodland creatures taken down by predators in bloody, violent acts. She has a whole passage about watching a frog being eaten alive by a water bug, which she says is also theology. But more importantly than God being in all things for her is people who can experience the holy in all things. She says our job is to open our spirits out like a sail so that when the holy moves, we're carried along with it, that we might one day, if we are lucky for a few minutes, see the tree with the lights in it. But most of the rest of our lives are before and after that moment. After the ecstasy, the laundry, as the Buddhists say. In the poem from Stanley Kunitz, when he talks about the layers versus the litter, that he's looking back over the course of his life and he sees abandoned campfires for moments in his life, friends and companions that have died or gone. That there's a dark moment in his life in which the moon is obscured and a voice comes to him and says, live in the layers, not the litter. In my life, I have only been able to distinguish layers from litter in hindsight. I think about a sabbatical that I was privileged to take about 5 years ago. You want to talk about privilege, a sabbatical. And in that moment, what I thought was, I will finally achieve rest and calm, away from meetings and email and appointments. I'll make my own schedule and spend time in the woods. And in that moment of peace, I will know holy wisdom. Yeah, right. What happened was that when I got calm and quiet enough, all of the litter I had been trying to ignore in my life came right to the surface, shouting as loud as it could, refusing to be ignored. If any of you have ever gone on a silent retreat or a multi-day meditation, you might know that on the third or fourth day, sometimes you wake up out of that moment and go, oh my God, I can't stand my sister. Or I'm about to quit this job. Or I think I'm in love. Or I think I'm not. But often when we still ourselves enough, it's not an escape at all. It allows the reality of our life to speak with a loud, booming voice. And in those months of pause, for me, I experienced what was, I think, the most difficult mental health time of my life. One that I would have paid to get away from, that did not look like God, that looked very much like litter. But that only now in hindsight I see was layers. That God was also in the earthquake, in the fire, in the depression, in the flood, and in the noise. Layer versus litter often depends on who's looking. And yes, it is good to protect ourselves from unnecessary noise and chaos of life, of toxic individuals and relationships, of unnecessary literal noise that can poison our bodies and spirits, of a 24-hour news cycle built to frighten you. The vitriol of so much of our modern discourse, it is good to step away from that and remove yourself in regular intervals, but do not assume that your spiritual life is meant to be an escape from your own life. None of us can afford to be on perpetual retreat, at least not most of us in the room. And even if you could, in the most silent places on earth, your life would come booming through with a clarity you might not hear in the hustle. The point is to practice finding God not only in the still, small voice, not only in the tree with the lights in it, but in all the other moments, which are legion. and which are most of our lives. To go searching for God in the litter and in the layers. To find that sometimes they're the same thing. To know deep in your bones that there is not a part of your life that has to be litter and not layers. That your addiction, your grief, your loss, your anger, your frustration, all the things that you would gladly leave by the roadside also have room to teach you about wholeness and the possibility of grace and goodness. That if it feels like you are not experiencing the tree with the lights in it or the still small voice, that's fine. Because the holy is in all the rest of it too. Speaking in you. The task is to ask yourself over and over again, what in this moment cries for my participation to make the world whole? Until your spirit becomes like a sail, and the slightest wind carries you on through your days. May it be so, and amen.